Okay, so we're going to continue on with talking about the tools that we're going to be most frequently using. I'm not going to go super deep into them because you've watched all the videos and you've done all of the reading this week. You have been inundated with tools, Photoshop tools. But as we go, I'm just kind of calling out the ones that we're going to use the most so that as we're going throughout the semester, you're kind of tuned into like, oh yeah, that's a really important one, or oh, that's one I kind of can push off to the side and not think about. So we ended with the lasso tools. Once again, quick way of just making selections. Let's talk about the other selection tool and the way that the movements of the selection tools are kind of laid out, especially the selection tools, which is the marquee tool, the lasso tool, and the magic wand. They kind of go from the less refined down to the more refined, right? So the magic wand is kind of the most refined of the selection tools right here. And the way that the magic wand works really simply is you click a pixel in your image, and Photoshop is going to select all the similar pixels in your image, right? So I just selected a pixel in the sky, and we see that Photoshop did a really good job of selecting all of the pixels in the sky. Almost all the pixels in the sky. If I zoom in, we're going to see that there's a little bit of weirdness there, right? So if we look, yeah, actually did a pretty good job, but if we look along this edge right here, didn't select these pixels over here. Now I could go shift and add those pixels, and it does a really good job. Or the other thing that I can do when you use this tool is, let me just deselect really quick, is you can always change the tolerance, right? So the more tolerant you make it, let me just go up to like 50 here. The more tolerant you make it, the more range in color and in contrast pixels Photoshop is going to select. So you see I went from the tolerance of 15, where it just selected the sky pretty well, to a tolerance of 50, and now it started selecting the highlights in the grass and in the tent. So it has become more tolerant, which means it's bringing in more pixels. We might not want all the way up there, right? Because it didn't select all of the sky with one click when we had the tolerance at 15, but we could bump it up to, 20, and I bet we could get a better job there. Maybe even a little higher to get everything in the sky. Let's go up to 25. We'll deselect. Let me go back over here. That did a pretty good job right there. It selected everything. Let's see. So that just made a really quick selection of pretty much everything in the sky. Now you might want to go in and clean this up later when we talk in more depth about selection tools, but it's a pretty good selection right there. And that was just by bumping around the tolerance. So let's just say that we had the tolerance way too high, and we were trying to select the sky, and we select it, and it's selecting like way too much, right? We can always bump the tolerance down. So when we make the tolerance less, it's saying, no, I want less pixels selected, less range of pixels, right? I want the highlights of the sky, but I don't want the highlights of this rock, or the highlights of my dog, or the highlights of the tent, right? And so we would just bump the tolerance down to something else, right? If we wanted something very specific selected, like the red of my dog's collar, let's see that. That did a pretty good job, but right, we wouldn't want to have to go and have to add all of those individually, because eventually it's going to start picking up the red in my dog's fur. So let's go 25. Let's see what happens here. Whoa, that's way too much. Let's go 15. So what this is kind of telling me right here is maybe this is not the tool for select. If I wanted to select this collar, maybe this isn't the tool for it, because it's either giving me too less or too little. So in an example like this, when I'm like, hey, I want to, I'm trying to select this, but it's either giving me, if I have the tolerance, way down, it's not giving me enough, or it's giving me too much. All right, so if I have the tolerance all the way down, it's not giving me enough. If I bump it up, it's going to give me way too much. That would tell me, oh, maybe that's not the tool, and I might want to go to, I don't know, the lasso tool and just trace around the collar. Something like that. I'm not doing the best job of this, so you'd obviously want to do a better job. I could also clean it up like this, and so that's just an example of sometimes even the most refined tool isn't the best tool. Right? There's a reason all these tools still exist, is because sometimes you need a straight line. Sometimes you want the magic wand. So let's go back into the magic wand and see the other tool below it, which is the quick selection tool. This is a newer tool in Photoshop. I think it's really useful. the way that it works is you just click and you drag over the pixels that you want selected. So if I want to just select the white of the tent, I could just click and drag over it, and it selected it, right? It did a really good job of selecting just the pixels of the tent. So once again, I just did that by clicking and dragging, and it added those pixels. If I wanted to select the blue of the tent down here, I would just click and drag over it. We see that it is also starting to include the pixels below the tent. So I could hold down Option and get rid of those. Or the other thing I want to show you is you can always use any of these tools in relation to the other one. So if I just wanted to clean up this selection really quick, I could just go to the lasso tool. And remember, I could hold down Shift and add to the selection. I could also go Option and subtract from the selection. So that's using two selection tools to really refine your selection. So those are really useful tools that we're going to use a lot. Obviously the crop tool we're going to use a ton. We've already talked about that quite a bit. The other tool I want to cover real quick is we are going to be using the eyedropper tool, which is our measurement tool. If I control click in that, we see other measurement tools. Now I don't really ever use any of these other tools, except for maybe the color sampler every now and then. We probably will get into that later when we're talking about color more. But the eyedropper tool is the most useful tool. And the way that it works is it's a bullseye tool, and you float around the image, and it's going to give you color information of the pixel that you float over. But to use this tool, you have to have the information palette open. So the way that we set up our workspaces is we have the info palette over here collapsed. Now if I click it, it will expand it, and if I float the eyedropper around, you'll see that the eyedropper will tell me where I'm floating right here on the tent is the RGB value right here and the CMYK value right there. So let's just pay attention to the RGB value. If I float over the tent is 161 parts red, 180 green, 216 blue. Now if I had my eyes shut and you read those numbers off to me, I would say, okay, we're looking at something that's like, you know, bluey green, not something that's red, because it's primarily, right, the primary balance of the color is in the blues. The less of it is in the reds. Where if I go down and float on, let's see, part of my dog, we're going to see that the red is now a higher number, right? So remember, this is a darker color than the tent, and so the numbers are a lot smaller, because remember, absolute black is 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue. So darker colors have smaller numbers. Lighter colors, like the sky over here, is going to have really high numbers, because 255 is going to be absolute white. So just kind of floating that information around, you can kind of get a guess about where the color information is in your image. So that is the measurement tool. Now let's talk about the retouching and painting tools. These are really useful tools. These are what we're going to be using to, you know, do the verb to Photoshop, right? When we're going to be changing things in a photo, right? So if I just take the spot healing brush, you guys already saw how this stuff works. You know what you're doing, but I'm just going to make my brush bigger. So a quick little hint that I use with any tool that is a brush, so spot healing brush, the clone stamp, or the paintbrush, is, right, you can always make your brushes bigger and smaller up here in the tool menu, right? You can make the size smaller, or you can make the brush size bigger. But that's kind of, you know, clunky to have to go up here and click that. And so to make the brush bigger and smaller, I often use the bracket keys on your keyboard. So those are in the top right, underneath the plus and minus keys on your keyboard. The right bracket is going to make your brush smaller. The left bracket is going to make your brush smaller. Right to make it bigger, left to make it smaller. So I think that's a really quick way of doing changing brush sizes, is with the bracket keys. So let me just show you real quick. Right, if I wanted to get rid of my dog, which clearly do not, I am going to select a brush that's roughly the size of, you know, of her, and I'm going to just paint over her. And Photoshop's going to do a good job of looking at that information and replacing it with something similar around it. Now it kind of takes a second. Oh, no kidding, it takes a second. My computer just froze here. Let's see what we get here. Got too much stuff open. Okay, there we go. So we see that it started to, it did a pretty good job of getting rid of my dog. I mean, that's kind of a tricky place because she's blocking off the corner of that tent. Did a pretty good job, but we can also, you know, go in and clean it up with more clicks, right? So I'm just clicking and it's going to start removing those pixels. You'll see. Sorry, Photoshop is kind of lag and I got a lot of stuff open on my computer right now. So, and this is a tool that actually takes a lot of effort, a lot of lifting from Photoshop, because it is actually having to analyze all of the information around the pixels that you're selecting and replacing it. So, right, that's just one way that you can go through and remove something from Photoshop. Let me go back before I did all that, because I don't want to get rid of my dog there. And I want to talk really quick about the brush hardness and softness. So, let me just kind of take my hardness of my brush all the way to 100. So this is the hardest brush that you possibly can have, and I'm going to make, let's see where we can do this and see the biggest change. Actually, I'm going to go to a different tool. I'm going to go to the clone stamp. So the clone stamp, the way that it works is you select, instead of Photoshop analyzing the information, you're selecting what you want to replace it with. So if I wanted to paint another version of my dog over here on the tent, I could do that. And the way that you do it is you take your little paintbrush, you make it bigger, smaller. Remember, I'm going to kind of show you how the hardness of the brush works and the softness. So I'm going to bump it up to 100. And I'm going to select my dog's face by holding down Option. So I'm going to float over my dog's face with the clone stamp selected. I'm going to click Option. That selects the pixels that I'm floating over. And I'm going to bring those pixels over here. And I'm going to click and paint my dog in over here. So that's how you can kind of... Now, nobody would use this tool like this. You know, obviously I'm not doing a very good job of it because you have this like clunky background here. But with a really small brush, you could do that. So let me actually zoom in if I wanted to give my dog 3 eyes, which I also don't want to do. Let's make our brush smaller. And I'm going to select this eye. And I'm going to paint an eye right in the middle of her forehead. And you see over to the left on her left eye, it's showing you where you're copying that information over, right? So that's with a really hard brush. We see with a really hard brush, you end up with this like really hard edge. If we bring our brush all the way down to 0%, and I do the same thing, let me click out of there, make my brush a little bit bigger with the right bracket key, and I'm going to hit Option, select my dog's face, and now if I start painting it over here, we see that it's doing this like diffused edge thing, right? So that's the difference, this hard edge compared to this diffused edge. Now, the softness is going to work if you use a smaller brush and slowly start painting in without trying to go over the border too much, right? So if you just wanted to paint her in, paint the dog in to the tent without adding a bunch of background around her, you'd want to use just a small brush and kind of go really slow with it like that, right? And we see that that's doing a way better job than, you know, using a big brush with total hardness. So this is quickly becoming a very weird photo, but that's how you do that. So those are the clone stamp and the spot healing brush. Now the other thing that I want to cover about this tool, it's really, you know, it's a tool you're going to use a lot. The reason, you know, but the thing about it is, you know, in module 1 we went and talked about the history tab and how we can jump back in history. But there are limitations. I think that the history tab records something like 35 to 55 actions. So that's all these things. Every one of these is an action. After that, it starts deleting the actions up top. So every time you click the clone stamp, you're adding an action. Every time I click it, it adds an action. So those fill up really quick. So something that I highly, highly, highly recommend, anytime you're using the clone stamp or the spot healing brush, I would go over here and click on your background and just hit Control, click, and hit Duplicate Layer, and just make a copy of the background. So now I have the background layer and the background copy. I could also click on the name background copy, and I'm just double click on the name background copy and hit clone stamp. So I know that this is actually the layer that I do the clone stamping on. So let me just go through and do some clone stamping here. I'm going to paint my dog. So I have 2 dogs over here, which is a dream. Let me actually make my brush a little bigger. Right, so I could do that. That's looking pretty good. Now, I could also go in and make my brush a little smaller, and now select from the tent, and clean up this selection here by painting the tent part over it. Select here, paint over that. That's looking pretty good. So in a couple clicks, I just added my dog to this picture. or I doubled my dog in this picture. Now, let's just say that I did that and I was like, well, that looks pretty good, but,